Prostitution or sex work is a social phenomenon. You cannot, strictly speaking, abolish it.
Hello, Dr. Lannier. Thank you for your time. So first, who are you? Please introduce yourself and your work.
So first, thank you for this opportunity today to share about my research. As you said, I am Dr. Salomé Lannier, and I am currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Luxembourg as a legal expert. I am currently being hosted by the Institute for Advanced Studies of the university, co-founded by the European Union, on the ProText project, which aims to better tackle exploitation, trying to clarify the divide or the continuum between criminal law and labor law.
So you've carried out research into sex work. What thoughts and findings do you find most relevant from your research?
I think one of the main interesting output I got from my research is how do we define sex work and how do we use both the term prostitution and sex work. And I think that nowadays we tend to think about sex work mostly into outdoor or indoor prostitution, and we tend to erase more of an umbrella concept of sex work in which you can include webcamming, porn, stripping, and other kind of people that might be closely or less closely connected to what we call prostitution. And I think that the legislation should tackle this diversity of forms of sex work to better understand what it means and how the people are living through it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you also mentioned once that you have different definitions on sex work in different countries. So how would you define sex work?
I don't think it's up to me to come up with a definition. It's really to the legislator to say we want to regulate these kinds of sex work. But if you want a very concrete example, there is one decision from the French High Court not so long ago that excluded webcamming from prostitution, considering that prostitution needs a physical touch between the client and the sex worker, for the sex worker to be able to satisfy the desires of the client. And that is very interesting to put in connection with sexual violence, because in other countries, such as in Belgium, you can have rape at a distance, meaning that even if the two people are not in the same room, so for instance through a webcam, you can have sexual violence because of violence, pressure, blackmailing. So if we say that there is no prostitution, or at least no sex work, through webcamming, you also erase the possibility that you might have sexual violence happening in this kind of settings. And then you don't protect specific people.
Okay, so if you had to choose one conclusion from your research that you would really like politics and society to know, and the lawmakers basically also, what would that conclusion be?
I really like most of the conclusions from research in New Zealand. So New Zealand was the first country to almost fully decriminalize sex work in 2003, if I'm not mistaken. And one of the main core strategy of the legislator was to collaborate with communities, NGOs made for and by sex workers. And that's really how they managed to implement such a big change in their legislation. So I think the main output, not of my research, but of colleague researchers in New Zealand, is really collaborate with people that are facing the issues that you want to tackle from a legislative perspective.
We're also coming to the legislation in a bit more. But first, I wanted to also ask a bit more your current position or your current thoughts around sex work, around society's attitude towards sex work, and also the politics of sex work.
So I am French. So I went to school in France. I went to university partly in France. And I got embedded in my mind the new abolitionist position of France, meaning we should abolish prostitution. By the way, that is not possible. If you take the definition of abolition in law, it means that you have to abolish a legal text. So, for instance, we could abolish slavery because slavery was a legal regime regulated by the state. So we could erase slavery from, let's say, the civil code. Prostitution or sex work is a social phenomenon. You cannot, strictly speaking, abolish it. So the point of the French politics is to erase prostitution. So that was my first idea. We have to erase prostitution because it's a violation to women's rights. And then I became a researcher and I started reading the research about Nordic model, the end-demand model, not only from a legal perspective, but also from a sociological perspective, and what is the impact of these kinds of legal frameworks on the people that are targeted. And then my mind slowly started to switch from being in favor of this new abolitionist framework up to in favor of decriminalization. So this is the stand I take right now as a researcher based on the evidence we have from science.
So you just mentioned it, women's rights. Feminists often argue about sex work. In the 70s and 80s, there were these so-called sex wars in the feminist movement when this movement basically split between the radical feminists on one hand, who were against pornography and sex work, and the queer or liberal feminists on the other hand, who saw pornography and sex work sometimes as a possible form of sexual self-determination. How do you see feminism, and what do you think of the sex wars?
I think it's an endless debate, to have a binary debate. And the approach I really like, that is a bit newer, is the risk-based approach. Meaning that, okay, there are people doing sex work, that's just a reality. And these people are facing some risks. They are facing risk for exploitation, for health problems, for being undocumented migrants. So the main point should be to aim to improve the lives of these people and make sure that their fundamental rights are protected and implemented. So I would say when I teach about prostitution, I have to teach about the sex workers. I have to teach about this binary vision. But what I like to talk about even more is how do we implement fundamental rights to make sure that people, whether they're sex workers or, for instance, platform workers, because they have also pretty not regulated working conditions, how do we make legislation work to improve the lives of these people? And behind the legislation, the implementation of the legislation.
So you would say that you have less of an ideological position and more practical position on the entire subject?
Yeah, I mean, politics is for ideological position. That's what they do. But when you are a researcher or when you are working on the ground, if you're a social worker, if you are law enforcement authorities, you have so many different priorities: human resources, financial resources. Can I get a residence permit for this person or not? The questions, the issues are much more pragmatic, and that these ones we can really go together in the same direction.
When people think of sex work or prostitution, they often think of exploited and abused women, sexualized violence, or human trafficking. Of course, all that exists too, but how do you see that?
So I am an anti-trafficking scholar. I did my PhD on human trafficking in line with the evolution of the offense through the use of new technologies by traffickers, but also by the victims themselves. So when people see that I'm researching on sex work and they come with this idea of, yeah, but sex work is only violence, I can tell them, I'm an anti-trafficking scholar. I know what exploitation looks like. I know what is human trafficking. And I still think that there is this continuum of, you have people choosing sex work voluntarily. You have people choosing sex work because of a lot of different reasons, for economical context, social context, migration context. And maybe that's the way they want to go, or maybe that's the way they are pushed to go. And then you have other kinds of violence, whether it is physical or psychological, that can lead to human trafficking and sexual exploitation. So I think there is this continuum, but we should also make this difference of there is sex work that should not be criminalized, and there is sex work, or in that case, not sex work, but sexual exploitation, that should be prosecuted. And there is also a pragmatical vision, is that if we consider all sex workers being victims from a criminal perspective, it means that law enforcement authorities should prosecute, should investigate everything that is happening to these people. And they might not have the resources to do so. So they will have to prioritize anyway. So then it's up to the legislative framework to follow and make sure that the people that are excluded from the criminal framework also get other kinds of legal protections, whether it is, I don't know, labor law, being an independent worker, etc. Data protection issues, family law protection issues as well.
What can you tell me about the intersectionality of sex work?
There is plenty. As a legal expert, my issue is that intersectionality is very hardly recognized in law. What we usually talk about is like multiple discriminations, but it's not exactly the same as intersectionality. So at least from a legal perspective, it's very hard to grasp this amazing idea of intersectionality. And then I think that intersectionality is everywhere regarding sex work, because you are going to have sex workers that are migrant, you are going to have sex workers, people of color, you are going to have trans sex workers. So it's part of how do they define sex work for themselves.
And sex work is often then linked to identity markers such as sex, gender identity, sexual identity, but also racialized or migrant identities. Can you tell me a bit more about this? Who, according to your research or what you have maybe also learned, who does sex work and why?
It's very hard to know exactly who is doing sex work because it's such an invisibilized activity. So the usual idea is that most sex workers are women, and when you extract sexual services advertisement online from a very broad diversity of websites, you tend to see that men sex workers are really out there. They're not, a very, very tiny percentage. They are a part of population in sex work. So yeah, basically my main answer is going to be we don't have data. And even if we have data, it stays in this very tiny population that we can see or that we can tackle. And even when we see this population, we are not sure if the data is being recorded correctly. So there I'm going to cite the work of an amazing colleague, an amazing French colleague, who is a sociologist, Gwenaëlle Vincent, and she accompanied the work of law enforcement authorities. And for instance, she said, she has seen police officers in some kind of forest around Paris, where you have outdoor prostitution. And they were just looking at the person. They were not even trying to talk to the person. And they were saying, well, this person is black, Nigeria. This person has kind of Asian characteristics, Chinese. Okay, but is that even correct? So, yeah, I really don't like to use data to make politics, because in the end we tend to hide more practical needs of the people, whether they are a specific race, a specific class, or a specific gender.
In your opinion, does European immigration policy mean that the number of sex workers in the migrant population is higher than the average numbers of sex workers in the general population? Or maybe differently asked, how does immigration policy play a role in the reasons why people might choose sex work and in the working and living conditions of sex workers?
So on the first question, it's very hard to answer because, again, we don't have data. The second question I think is more interesting. because we have some research that has been done on the impact of restricting migration legislation on exploitation. And we have seen through research that when a state or the European Union, let's say, is restricting the migration legislation with fewer opportunity to migrate safely and legally, we tend to see more exploitation. There is more smuggling of migrants. They ask for more money. The smuggling process is being done in harsher conditions with more violence along the way. And when the people arrive, for instance, within the European Union, you might have fewer ways to make sure that you become a documented migrant with a right to stay, a residence permit. So there is, from a criminal perspective, you would say that unsafe migration is because of traffickers, smugglers. But we tend to hide the role of the state or the European Union in regulated migration and the direct link it has with exploitation or conditions of migrating against the dignity of the person.
What would you say is the link between class and sex work? Would you say that the policy hostile to sex workers would also be classist? What's your opinion on that?
So again, I'm going to take a concept that comes from the sex workers themselves, which so what they call hierarchy or putarchie in French, saying that when you regulate about sex work, usually you tend to put this class of sex workers. So, well, we are going to restrict street prostitution because we don't want the neighbors to complain about it. But we don't do anything about indoor prostitution. And escorts. Yeah, but escorts, they're not really prostitutes. They don't sell sex. They sell company. And then you create this discrimination among sex workers. And sometimes we even see sex workers discriminating against each other to say, but it's the fault of migrant sex workers that are lowering the prices. So I don't want to talk with them. I don't want to interact with them. The issue is, as regarding the sex workers, we are starting to exclude people from a movement that should be directed in favor of improving fundamental rights of everyone, whether they are migrant sex workers, poor or precarized sex workers, or very high-class sex workers. Because the bottom line is pretty much the same.
You mentioned the Nordic model already a few times, so just to clarify again, the Nordic model is a form of neo-abolitionism of sex work. Instead of criminalizing sex workers, the Nordic model criminalizes their clients. What do you think of the Nordic model? You've mentioned already a few things, but maybe we can go a bit more in depth. What are the effects in countries that have introduced this model?
So why do we call this model the Nordic model? Because it has been adopted first by Sweden and then by many Nordic countries, Denmark, Norway. And then the name changed a little bit into neo-abolitionism in link with the abolitionism movement in the UK in the 19th century. And you also see this kind of legislation being named as the end demand model, with this idea that if we criminalize client, we are going to erase prostitution. So we try to kill the demand instead of killing the, how do you say that in English? The offer. So first it relies on an economical model, which we actually don't know if it's working or not. Because again, it's a matter of data. And as I said, we don't have data. I think the idea was not so bad in the minds of politicians, but when you see the research outputs, the objective is not met. So, for instance, the Nordic model has been adopted in France, in some parts of Canada, and there we have a lot of research, especially in Canada. A lot of research has been published in the past year. And what we can see is more violent working conditions for sex workers, reduction of a decrease in the prices because they cannot impose their conditions to the clients anymore. They don't have this negotiation time. And also more unsafe conditions in doing sex work. So less condoms, which means more unwanted pregnancy, which means more sexual health problems, etc. So that's the part of the relationship between the client and the sex workers. And then you have the relationship between the sex workers and the state, especially law enforcement authorities. And there we have seen that sex workers tend to not trust the police, not trust law enforcement authorities anymore. And that the role of the police is changing. And it's not so much into protection, but they switch their priority into migration control, which leads to, obviously, discriminatory controls. Especially of sex workers of color. So, again, I come from a neo-abolitionist country, which I thought was the right way to go. And then I saw all of this research being done, including in Sweden, including in France, in Canada. And that the people that were aimed to be protected are actually working and living in worse conditions, which is kind of an irony. So yeah, in France you have the exit strategy, meaning that there are some rights that are granted to certain prostitution victims to exit prostitution. But first they have to go through a selection process, which is very harsh and very limited. And even if you are selected to be part of this program, you get very limited rights. So, for instance, you get, I think it's around 300 euros every month. And you cannot do sex work anymore. And probably you are ongoing training to find another job, but you're, let's say, unemployed at the moment. And you only have 300 euros coming in every month. What do? You cannot pay rent. You barely can eat, maybe. So obviously, this exit program has been highly criticized by the research, but also especially sex workers themselves, to say, maybe I want to exit the sex work industry. But even with this program, it's not the way out.
Representatives of the Nordic model believe that the aim is to protect women. Sex workers often retort then that it is a more paternalistic attitude that doesn't really listen to the people concerned. Do you have any thoughts about that?
I would say I agree, because the basis for this model is a moralistic perspective that only consider this binary vision of women are sex workers are women and clients are men. So by default, it has to be a gender-based oppression, which can be true in a way, but the reality is still that the sex workers themselves are going to say, we don't want clients to be criminalized because we want to conduct our activity in safer conditions. So then it's the state decided for you as a woman. And I think that's also against the core idea of feminism. And feminism, at least in my perspective, is to give the tools and the different paths to the woman. And the women are choosing, depending on, obviously, everything that is going on in the social and economical context. But if you impose something to a woman, whether it is you have to abort or not, you have to get pregnant or not, you have to do sex work or not, it's essentializing women to say, as a woman, you should be this, or you should not be this. And then you don't give this choice to the persons, especially from a legal perspective.
So why don't you think that many people say they want to protect sex workers but then act against their requests or wishes?
So in research, that's what we call the rescue industry, which is basically trying to rescue people but ending up in similar exploitation conditions or restrictions of fundamental rights. So, for instance, we've seen that in some countries where they have shelters for victims of prostitution, but the people cannot leave the shelter. The phones are taken away, they have to wear specific clothes, they don't know when they will be able to go out, or they have to undergo mandatory medical controls that can be very invasive. So again, is where do we put this limit of we might restrict fundamental rights because we think that something is exploitation and we need to go to a criminal procedure, or we think it's outside of the criminal system, but we still need to improve the fundamental rights of a certain population, but still giving them an array of choices.
Why do we then often still hear that studies would have shown that the Nordic model actually has improved the situation for sex workers, or that it actually reduced sex work? Why do we still hear these quotes then?
Especially in Sweden, before you could see kind of sex work, especially street-based sex work, and they had some kind of data. And after the Nordic model law was adopted, obviously everyone, clients and sex workers, went in the dark, in the shadows, went hiding. So then you don't have the data anymore. But does that mean that sex work has reduced or disappeared? Usually it's just a misreading of the data in favor of a specific politics.
So what's then the difference between legalization and decriminalization? And also, is there something that you would say you would prefer?
So I would say that legalization is something that has been done in Germany and the Netherlands. And basically, it's purely the fact to make brothels legal. So brothels were illegal before in Germany and the Netherlands, and now it's legal. We legalized brothels. But it does not mean that you consider sex work in a comprehensive perspective. So, for instance, you have very limited labor rights, or not at all. Or you legalize it, but then you push sex workers to only be legal, the activity only being legal when it's being done in brothels. Meaning that you exclude sex workers being independent, basically. So you still fit sex workers in this tiny legal category while giving free roaming for brothels. Decriminalization is different in the sense that it takes the broader picture. It's not only about legalizing brothels, but we want to decriminalize the activity of sex work in general, meaning that we want to obviously decriminalize sex workers themselves. So, for instance, we still have countries within the European Union that have loitering offenses, which means that when you're in the street and you behave in a specific way, you can be fined by the police because we consider that it's against good morals. Decriminalization also aims to rethink about the pimping offense, because in specific countries, pimping is very broadly defined. For instance, in France, if you are the partner of a sex worker and the sex worker is paying the rent, you are indirectly benefiting from the proceeds of sex work. So you are a pimp. And we've seen convictions of partners because they would, for instance, help their sex worker partner by, lending a part of the apartment or taking care of online advertisement. So this is second, that's the pimping offense. Obviously, you have the legalization of brothels. And then outside of this criminal area, you have the second question of, okay, now we don't criminalize anymore sex work. But how do we make sure that fundamental rights are implemented in favor of sex workers? And there you can have a very broad array of legislation. Labor law if sex workers are considered as employees. You also have the legislation around independent activities that could also create new rights in favor of sex workers. You could have an exit program, because not everyone is doing sex work for fun, to make it very down to earth. And then, especially when you think about porn, you have other questions coming into the spectrum. Especially, you have data protection. Since the GDPR, we have a right to be forgotten. But we know that on the internet, you have porn videos from the very beginning of the internet, from the 90s. Maybe these persons have changed their life, and maybe they would like specific videos to be erased. So you also have this data protection issue, and even more areas of law that I'm not an expert in, but that really shows the necessity to study sex work from an interdisciplinary perspective. There is the law, there is the sociology, and a broad array of sciences to try to make it pragmatically better for the people concerned by this issue, well, by this activity, by this topic.
So what are the effects, you've mentioned them already a little bit, but what are more of the effects in the countries that have introduced the decriminalization, such as Belgium and New Zealand? Belgium is quite recent, but I guess in New Zealand we have already some data on that.
For New Zealand, we have already quite some data. We have seen that the working conditions are improving, that you have sex workers have more power of negotiations in front of clients, but also in front of, for instance, brothel owners. So you are kind of empowering the sex workers to give them the legal tools to say, I can defend myself and I know what my rights are. We have also seen more trust being built between sex workers and the police, that sex workers would be more willing to go to the police to file complaints about exploitative conditions, about violent clients as well. And we've seen that also the community services and NGOs that are supporting sex workers receive a better, how to say that? They're better received. There is the help being provided to sex workers is much more visible, is much more open and accepted. So obviously, decriminalization is not a magical solution. It's not like you wave your magic wand and that's it. We still see a lot of stigmatizations of sex workers in New Zealand. There is obviously still violence against sex workers, both from clients, pimps, the police, etc. But that's a matter of implementation of the law and education of people in a broader way. Because if you have a violent client and the client is raping a sex worker, it's a matter of sex education, because this client could also rape their partner, any other person. It's not because they are raping a sex worker that it's not included within this broader context of sexual violence that should be better identified, prosecuted, and that victims of sexual violence should be better protected and assisted.
So your research is mostly based on the French model, but I wonder what you think of the Luxembourg model. Luxembourg has opted a little bit for middle way. There are elements of regulation or legalization. Sex work is not banned per se, but there are also elements of the Nordic model. Clients are punished if they buy sex from a so-called vulnerable person. How do you see the Luxembourg model?
It's such a mix. At first, I thought it was very close to the French model. But indeed, it's not such a copy-paste. So you have regulations from the city of Luxembourg that is allowing sex work in specific streets. Obviously, sex workers are not there. They're somewhere else. You have the criminalization of clients, but especially when they are having this kind of sex work relationship with vulnerable sex workers. The issue is, how do you define vulnerability and how do you prove vulnerability in this context? Because you have to prove it because it's a criminal offense. Sex workers are not criminalized for sex work itself, but there are still elements of the criminal code that enable to criminalize sex workers through loitering, through a fine. It's a very minor offense, but there are still elements of criminalization. So I think it's a model that is not clear because the politics are not clear on what do they want to achieve for now. And that's why I would not say it's a model. It's just a mix of different pieces of legislations that came into the law because of inspirations from Belgium, from France, and still trying to be a little bit pragmatic, but not having this vision of where do we want to go. So yeah, I would not say there is a model. It's just more like a patchwork of pieces of legislation.
So you would say that you're a bit more critical than of the Luxembourg model, it sounds, or do you also see some advantages?
I think there is everything to do. Because if you don't have a vision, you can set up a vision. And then you can start from there. So I think Luxembourg is at the crossroads of all the models we have almost all the models we have in Europe, France, Belgium, and Germany. And I would even include the Netherlands through the Benelux Union. So I think that the legislative change in Belgium is going to have impacts in Luxembourg. And Luxembourg, at some point, will have to clearly set a choice. If not, the collaboration is going to be very hard in between these three countries.
I mean, you point something out there. I mean, Luxembourg is the legislation in Luxembourg is kind of at this crossroads, but Luxembourg is also geographically in between all these three different countries and models. Again, like in Germany, we have the regulation, in Belgium, we have the decriminalization, in France, the Nordic model. What effect does that have on cross-border sex work here in Luxembourg? Or what do you think are the effects of these different kinds of national legislations on sex work in regions like in Luxembourg, where it is easy to cross borders between these countries?
So the Belgian decriminalization system is very new, so it's very hard to foresee what will be the result. But for instance, when we had the abolitionist framework being passed in France, we saw a lot of sex workers going to Belgium to say, well, now I will be in Belgium because I'm less criminalized there. So we might see Luxembourgish sex workers moving to Belgium saying, now it's fully decriminalized. Or, for instance, brothels being open at the border in Belgium. Another issue would be that pimping is reduced in Germany. The definition of pimping is more restrictive in Germany compared to Luxembourg. So you might have a situation of someone doing sex work in Luxembourg, and the police knows about it and says, this is exploitation, we are going to prosecute, we're going to investigate. And then the person is crossing the border back to Germany, and the Luxembourgish police is asking for information or help from the German police, and the German police is saying, yeah, but this person is registered as a sex worker in Germany, so for us it's not an offense. And then it cuts short any kind of collaboration possible.
What are your recommendations then for Luxembourg?
Well, first to discuss about it's not up to me to decide on the system, but maybe to clarify where they want to go, just to make sure that they have a specific, or at least they know what is their stance, what they stand for when they are discussing with the other neighboring countries and when they are dealing with sex workers situations in Luxembourg.
And then finally, maybe, what do you think a good sex work policy should look like? We've seen all these different kinds of models now, but what should the laws look like? What would you like the state, the legal system, and society do to improve the situation of sex workers?
I'm not going to give a straightforward answer to this question, but for me, good policy is a policy including the affected persons. So to have this open dialogue with NGOs supporting sex workers, with sex workers themselves, and have a government, a policy that is proactively trying to reach out to these populations, saying, if you speak out, we're not going to find you and send you back to your country, or we're not going to find you and prosecute your pimp. So yeah, mostly this, because the output can be different depending on countries. And because Luxembourg has this specific geographic situation, we might have needs or questions that are new or at least specific to Luxembourg. And that's why it's so important to have this connection with the people affected by the topic at stake.
Is there anything else you would like to share at the end?
Let me think for a sec. Read my papers. No, I think we discussed all the topics that were really relevant to this topic.
Then thank you very much, Dr. Lannier.
Thank you.